Good afternoon, members, and welcome to this afternoon's speaker event. It is my pleasure to bring to you Roger Hallam, co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, to talk to us this afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's speaking event, Mr. Hallam.
Okay, well, hello everyone. I can't actually see anyone, but presumably there are people there. My name's Roger Hallam, as has just been said. I'm a co-founder of Extinction Rebellion. I'm also a co-founder of a new political party called Burning Pink. And before I start, I just need to say I'm only talking on my own behalf in this presentation. So what I say is only what I think, not necessarily what Extinction Rebellion thinks, for instance. Okay, so my guiding light in the presentation is the quote from John Locke, which was used at the Declaration of Rebellion against the British government by Extinction Rebellion in 2018, which goes as follows: to love truth for truth's sake is the better part of perfection in this life and the seed plot of all other virtues. So I'm going to endeavour to tell you the truth without fear or favour. And the basic position I'm going to be communicating is that this space for reformism in political society is now over, and only revolutionary change will save us from social collapse. Okay, so I want to say something about my approach. So when I was taken on as a PhD student at King's College, my supervisor said I was the best PhD student he'd ever had. And I'm not saying that because I'm trying to be big-headed. I'm just trying to say it because I think the reason for that is because I would describe myself as a ruthless empiricist. In other words, what I'm interested in doing is not particularly moralizing or speculating or deluding myself by things that I want to see. I want to look at what actually is and what is actually happening. And this is more difficult than you think, particularly when you're talking to elite audiences, no disrespect intended, but these audiences tend to be very ideological in my view, partially because they have a very strong and irrational view that progress is inevitable, when obviously that's historically illiterate. Secondly, that they believe reformism is the only way that society is effectively changed, which often is the case in many periods of history, but often isn't the case as well. And thirdly, because of their material and cultural privilege, it's very difficult for them to see a world where they don't have that privilege. So the psychological uptake summary, I suppose, is that people tend to not believe what they don't like. And that's as strong with very intelligent people as it is for not so intelligent people. And so that's what we're up against. So in terms of a rational use of my time, I would say probably the worst audience to talk to is Oxford students, because 99% of you aren't quite going to accept what I'm going to say for the reasons above. However, the catch in the tail is I have good reason to believe maybe 1% of you, maybe more, maybe less, will be able to see the clarity of what I've got to say, unclouded by the various ideological interferences. Okay, so that's my introduction. So I'm just going to go through the reality that we face in 2021. Obviously, this is going to be quite broad and basic, and I will hope that there'll be some questions on it if needs be. So I like to talk about the real world. And I think when people talk to you about the climate crisis, then one of the ways you can work out that they're trying to deceive you is they don't actually talk about any figures. So if you're a good empiricist, the first thing you need to start off with is the figures. So here are the figures, and then I'll interpret what they mean in terms of the political and social implications. So the figures are at the most important figures are as follows. So in 2020, we were 1.3 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. Between 2000 and 2010, global temperatures went up by 0.2 of a degree. Between 2010 and 2020 by 0.3. So it's a reasonable prediction that between 2020 and 2030, they're going to go up by 0.3, arguably by 0.4. The upshot of it is in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll be going over 1.5 degrees centigrade, which, as I presume you know, is the limit set by the Paris Agreement. So the first prediction is the Paris Agreement will fall apart within the next 5 to 10 years because of the force of geophysical reality, as you might say. So that's the first thing to consider. Secondly, we also have what are now two really concrete locked-in additions to that temperature increase. The first one is that the Arctic ice in the summer will be melted by 2035, adding 0.4 degrees centigrade to that total, and global dimming, which is the pollution in the atmosphere, which has been placed there through the emission of fossil fuels. When that is removed, then the sun's rays will heat up the Earth by approximately 0.5 of a degree of centigrade. So we've got the 2.5, which is more 1.5, which is more or less locked in, and we have these two debts, as you might say, which are going to be impacted upon us, bringing us to 2.5 degrees centigrade of locked-in temperature. And then we've got the wild cards, as you might say, of methane in the permafrost, which if it melts by, say, 1%, then it will increase temperatures by 1 degrees centigrade. And Amazon dieback, 17% of the Amazon is now cut down. Estimates suggest that when it gets cut down by between 20 and 25%, then it will collapse as an ecosystem, again raising temperatures arguably by 1 degree centigrade. So the domino effect here, as you might say, is once we get to 2.5 degrees centigrade, we almost certainly will have knocked over the domino of the permafrost methane problem or catastrophe and the Amazon dieback, and that will take us up into the region of 4 degrees centigrade, which everyone agrees will be the end of civilized life. The reason why it's the end of civilized life and will be the end of civilized life at 2.5 degrees centigrade is because that isn't the main figure. The main figure, as you may know, is the doubling of that, i.e. the temperature over the land. So temperature over the land is double or even 3 times the global average. So what we're actually looking at 2.5 degrees is an average temperature of 5 degrees centigrade. But again, that's not really the figure to think about. The figure to think about is what happens on a hot day. So if it's 5 degrees centigrade, then on a hot day, it's going to be 10 to 15 degrees above average. And that takes you over 30 degrees centigrade, which is the commonly agreed tipping point where crops die or don't grow. So that will produce the inability to grow grain and corn at scale in the center of continents, which is the basis of civilized life. Added on to that, of course, is the extremities of the temperatures. So the temperatures will become more extreme because of the breakdown of the jet stream, which we can talk about if you like. So in other words, the hot days will be more often. So this is why the social implications are that at 2 degrees centigrade, according to a recent paper, there will be 1,000 million refugees in the world fleeing Central America, Africa, India, and other tropical areas of the world. At 3 degrees centigrade, we can double that and say there's 2,000 million people. But somewhere in 1 in 6 and 1 in 4 people will be on the move within 20 years, according to these estimates. So really what we need to look upon is not the more or less locked in consequences of what's happened over the next 30 years. We need to look at the social and political implications of global civilizational collapse. Okay, so this is where it gets a little bit more new territory, as you might say. So I want to make sort of 3 suggestions about what this will mean, all of which I think are no-brainers from a sort of empirical point of view. But as you'll see, they've got major challenges to the sort of ideological position of people in elite positions in society at the moment. So the first one is that reformism is dead at this point in history, in so much as if you take the analogy with a car, you can keep mending your car, but at a certain point you take it to a mechanic and the mechanic will say it's simply not going to carry on any further and you need a new car. Well, the same thing happens sociologically, that often in social systems you can reform them from within, but there's a certain point where the challenges internally and externally reach such an extent that only a new political system, a new political regime will be able to deal with the crises that are coming down the road. So I think it's more or less a no-brainer that the major political regimes around the world will collapse in the next 10 to 20 years, given that over 1,000 million people will be on the move, and that will also involve the mass rape, slaughter, and starvation of hundreds of millions of people. The second thing is the notion that the elites will become liable in courts of law for their criminalities over the last 30 years. Obviously, this is a bit of a no-brainer given that they consciously and knowingly have engaged in activities which have produced the catastrophic breakdown of social systems around the world. So we can see over the next 10 to 20 years, leading members of global elites being imprisoned or even worse in social breakdown situations. The third implication is the necessity and inevitability of revolution. So I'm not being rhetorical here, I'm being sociological again. So the literature you might want to check out after this presentation is the Sociology of Revolution, which many liberal scholars have investigated for the last 30 years. And that will give you an idea of the dynamics of social collapse and regime transformation, because the dynamics are broadly the same over the last 200 or 300 years. The three main scenarios here are there's a top-down revolution when the elites take control of societies in order to force through major geoengineering and reduction of carbon emissions. The other scenario is a radical left fascist scenario where fascist dictatorships take over and either ignore the climate catastrophe or impose an eco-fascist solution. And the third alternative, which you won't surprise you, is I'm most interested in, is a radical democratic revolution whereby citizens' assemblies create the legitimacy, the democratic legitimacy to slash consumption, carbon emissions, and massive investment in geoengineering. So those are really the things that are on the table, I suppose. What I want to suggest then is that the most rational, ethical and smart decision for Oxford students is to leave the elites and to leave Oxford University and engage in revolutionary activity, in so much as a progressive revolutionary outcome over the next 10 to 20 years will require a critical mass of people who believe in that pathway. And if we don't get that, then obviously the future is very dark. And I really want to emphasize, I suppose, that for students at elite universities in the global north at the present time, that you have four options. The first option is to enter the world of business, and that I see as becoming complicit in the greatest genocide in human history, actively creating that genocide. Or you want to engage in the political elites, which will involve you in administrating the greatest genocide in human history, or you'll enter various NGOs or third sector organizations where you'll be putting reformist sticking plasters on the greatest genocide in human history. So in that context, I would suggest that the revolutionary fourth option, which is to leave the political elites and engage in mass mobilization, is the smartest and most moral option. And also, I would argue, the safest option in terms of what will happen to the elites over the next decade or two. So that's a quick summary. As I said, I'm not making any particular moral judgments there. I'm making an analysis of the situation. I will finish with a quote, which is will be upsetting, but I think really it's good to concretize what I've just said in the historical experience. And when I did my first Heading for Extinction talk, I talked about the invasion of Russia by the Nazis in 1941, which led to the starvation of 3 million Soviet troops. And 4 years later, Soviet troops invaded East Germany and participated in the rape of 2 million German women. And I'll just read this quote, and then I suggest maybe you have a few moments of silence. So this is a quote by a Russian soldier. You can see it on YouTube. It's Russian veteran recalls their crimes in Germany. So it goes as follows. Suddenly, I started to hear screams. I went to the window and saw the major come out. He was the bad man, Major Andronov. He ordered his men into 2 lines, 1 for each girl. They caught the girls, stripped them, and began to rape them. Everyone in the 2 lines took turns raping these 2 little girls. They started to bleed. I looked at it all in horror. When these 2 girls passed out, they were shot in the mouth. And nearby was a pigsty, and the bodies of the 2 girls were thrown in the pigsty. I went to the pigsty in half an hour, and there were only the skulls of these girls and the crosses with beads. The pigs were hungry and ate them. There was mass rape, a continuous rape of women, in which everyone took part.
Thank you for that opening, Mr. Hallam. I'd just like to quickly sort of like mention a quick sort of apology for anyone who might have found the last speech without a trigger warning a bit uncomfortable. Of course, the issues we're talking about today are very, very important, and of course, they are going to have uncomfortable themes to deal with it. I think that the last point, I'll start from the back and start from the last point which you made, Mr. Hallam, and you argued that students who are in elite universities such as Oxford should, the best thing they can do is effectively to leave. But also I recognize that you were a successful student yourself, studying PhD at King's College London. You even went so far as being able to convince the university to implement the boldest net zero plan of any university in the country and getting it to divest from fossil fuels. And in the fact that you've succeeded within the system and also benefited from the system, why do you think it is the case that young people who perhaps might be in Oxford through a social mobility circumstances are best served by not partaking in the same privileges that you did yourself?
Yeah, well, I won't be finishing my PhD, just as a matter of fact, because I am leaving King's College for the reasons I've outlined in this communication to you. I don't doubt for a minute, obviously, through the experiences I had through taking direct action at King's College, that you can engage in institutional change through direct action in your university. However, that's like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic in terms of a strategic and moral overview of what needs to happen at this point in history. And what I'm saying is, in many points in history, students and people who have the intelligence and moral integrity do leave the elites in order to engage in revolutionary activity, because they correctly make the judgment that the society they're in is morally corrupt to the point of collapse. And if there was a point in human history where this was the case, then sociologically, I can't think there's any argument that this is not the most, the most immoral moment in human history, given the extremity of what the elites have constructed for your generation over the next 20 years.
Thank you. One thing I found quite interested in your speech, which sort of like advocate for a very, very starch and unapologetic conclusion to solving the climate crisis, is your recognition of the fact that reformist approach are redundant. You believe that it's pointless. And I also recognize that in the same vein, Extinction Rebellion was quite successful in getting governments to announce climate emergency and announce the net zero plan for 2050. So I was wondering, do you think that Extinction Rebellion got it wrong then? Or what would you go back to change then, since the reformist approach seemed to be an approach that somehow worked for you, for a company that for a movement that you co-founded in the past?
Yes, well, we need to understand that what works is what is necessary to minimize the catastrophe that's now locked in. So what many people think of what works is what I would call sort of postmodernist posturing. In other words, declaring climate emergency self-evidently has nothing necessarily to do with reducing carbon emissions. To reduce carbon emissions, you have to create legislation that forces companies to change their behaviour and individuals to change their behaviour. In that respect, nothing substantive has been done. And the point, of course, is even if something was done, it wouldn't be enough to prevent us going past 2.5 degrees and upwards towards 4 degrees. In other words, like everything is irrelevant at this point in time, apart from a revolutionary transformation in the economy. And that requires the change of a political regime, given the literature on how rapid political change works. So I want to emphasize here that I'm not saying this because I'm some extreme political revolutionary or what have you. I think many of the people who are in governmental spaces are fully aware of what I've said today and would agree with what I've said, not least because many of them have said what I've just said to you, to me, but it tends to be said privately. But what usually happens in elite circles is people use euphemistic descriptions of what's going to happen, such as David Attenborough's collapse of civilization. Well, a collapse of civilization basically means what I just described in the quote. And the problem with elite spaces is they don't really think clearly through what the implications are in terms of the necessity for revolutionary change.
Very interesting. I guess this is probably a good segue to talk about revolutionary change and talk about practical ways to achieve it. And you mentioned earlier on about your party Beyond Politics, and I was wondering what your future plans are for Beyond Politics, and how likely you believe that you'd be successful in ensuring that the Citizens' Assembly replace parliaments, as a way of creating political decisions that are made in this country. What sort of like roadmap could you draw out, or perhaps predict or wish would need to be followed in order to achieve the change socially socially to get the outcome that you think is best?
Well, I should say, without advertising myself too much, there's a YouTube video called Pivoting to the Endgame, where I describe in an hour and a half how this works. But in terms of a brief summary, the strategy historically of revolutionary movements is usually twofold. One is to engage in mass direct action, and the other element is to enter the corridors of power in order to undermine the elites through that mechanism. So Burning Pink is the first iteration, as I see, of a post-carbon revolutionary party, which is doing both those elements, which is engaging in direct action with a move towards mass civil resistance, and then also standing in elections in order to take control of assemblies. Now, obviously, most people watching will think both of those things are ridiculous, of course, and they do seem ridiculous at the present moment in time. But the important thing to understand, in so much as I'm talking to the 1% of students to understand this and have studied political history, is political conditions change very rapidly once you enter into what is traditionally called the fiscal crisis of the state. In other words, at a certain point over the next 5 to 10 years, there'll be massive social breakdown leading to economic collapse due to the geophysical changes that are now locked in. Once those crises happen, then the political atmosphere changes very rapidly. You saw an example of this, for instance, in 2008, in a small way with the economic crisis then. So, for instance, like the left-wing party in Greece went from approximately 5% of the vote to 40% of the vote in 12 months. So the strategy of Burning Pink and the strategy of a revolutionary movement is always to wait for and prepare for that rapid turn of history. And once that rapid turn of history comes, then obviously they're well positioned to take power. And in terms of the Burning Pink strategy, the radical democratic strategy, then the idea is not to take power, but to give power to assemblies of ordinary people, because that provides the popular legitimacy for the massive sacrifices and social changes that are now inevitable.
Thank you. For the purposes of bringing about these social changes, it requires a moral obligation for individuals to take their lives and put their lives at stake here, because we have bigger things to worry about. And yourself, you've been subjugated to sort of preemptive arrest due to your plan to fly drones over Heathrow Airport. They also, arrested and workers that supported you who were not taking part in the action themselves. And recognizing this progressive approach or a unique approach to tackle or bring about social change. I wonder what your thoughts are, or what you think, the actions against you, locking you up, tells us about the future of criminal prosecutions and peaceful protests in the UK. And I guess another question onto that is, do you think there needs to be a change in tactic?
So the first thing to understand about rapid political change is people engage in it not through tactical calculations, but through a sort of visceral outrage. Political change is brought about through the force of material conditions. The reason why you think it's unique, I suppose, is because we've been caught in a very unique period of history over the last 30 to 40 years, where there's been very little political disruption in a classical sense of the word. So we don't really understand, particularly in the global north, of course, what political disruption classically defined means. Classically defined, it means thousands of people on the street, hundreds of people killed, thousands of people arrested, and thousands of people put into prison. And that's the mechanism through which political change works every 30 to 50 years in most countries around the world. So that's what's coming down the line. The main sort of light bulb moment, I suppose, for people when they're considering this is to understand that the harm and horror is already locked in. So this is what drives people onto the streets, is the realization they're already going to get hurt and they're already being hurt. So the calculation, in so much as there is a calculation, obviously often there isn't, it's more of a visceral process, is they go and engage in rebellious activity because that's the safest option at that point. So that's how most rebels see their political activities historically, and that's how I see my activities. It doesn't surprise me at all that I get put into prison or arrested. That's part of the process. And if you look historically at most rebellions, a professional rebel, as it were, expects this to happen. It's part of the process of creating change. And as I say, the reason for doing that is because people are going to get hurt anyway, as the phrase goes.
Thank you. On the topic of rebels and the unfortunate realities that they have to go through, I think that for some individuals who would want to get involved in involved in public action and citizenry, they're perhaps a little bit more disadvantaged. More specifically, I'm talking about whether you think that Extinction Rebellion and the movement in general has sort of like exacerbated what some might call, white privilege by using tactics that put people of color at risk than more than white people. How would you respond to such criticism that kind of imply that these methods are methods which it's not okay, but it's less punishable by one group and heavily sort of like punished by when committed by another group?
Well, I think the premise of the criticism is incorrect. The civil resistance is primarily used by poor people around the world in order to prevent their extreme exploitation or oppression. And the calculation, I suppose, as I said, to reiterate my previous answer, is once an oppressed group understands that they're going to get hurt anyway, then they engage in civil resistance. And of course, the more likely, the more poorer and what have you are, then the more likely you're going to get hurt, and to a greater extent. So what we'll see over the next 10 years is increasing numbers of people from those groups engaging in civil resistance, as the implications of the climate emergency are imposed on the lower classes of societies, both in the global north and the global south. So I think the debate is somewhat academic at this stage because of the extremity of what's coming down the line. And yeah.
Thank you. A question from one of our attendees I thought was quite relevant in the response you gave now, in the sense that you expect that more people from all backgrounds, especially those who are affected by it the worst, which are the poorer backgrounds, will sort of flock to this movement flock to realizing that something needs to be done. But anonymous attendee asked that, people will respond to fire or run to see a flood and try to escape. What you're describing, especially with the centigrade temperature increasing, is a very slow and not very visible onset of catastrophes. So how do you expect people to respond to something that's happening at such a slow rate before it's too late?
Yeah, well, that's the best question so far. Because this is the horrific conundrum, right, of the situation that is facing people today, and obviously particularly young people. And the question is perfectly correct, that civil resistance is propelled forward by the actuality of social injustice. In other words, it's in your face. And the most terrible thing about the climate catastrophe, of course, is it hasn't wholly happened yet, at least to many people around the world. And at the same time, it's completely locked in. So it's got those two characteristics that make it enormously difficult for the changes to happen in time. So the sort of honest answer to the question is, at the danger of being censored, we're totally fucked, right? That's the conundrum we're in. Now, having accepted that structural situation, there is a possibility that we can overcome this problem. And the way it's overcome is by enacting the disruption that's inevitably coming in the future in the present moment. So a critical mass of people engage in civil resistance, and the civil resistance is, as what you might call, a proxy for the horror that's coming down the road. So people have their lives disrupted and the economy is disrupted, and that forces a moral and rational awakening, as it were, of the population. And people then realize that have to act now and force their governments to act. But there's no possibility of this happening, according to human psychology, I would argue, unless there's the mass disruption, because people rightly don't respond to something unless it's in their face. So this is what makes proactive mass mobilization that I spent 70 hours a week organizing around the world so important, that we have to proactively create this civil resistance in the present moment to the extent that is necessary in order to get the change of regimes that are needed.
Thank you. It seems one thing that's implicit in the responses so far is that perhaps, correct me if I'm wrong, you seem to think that things like maybe going green has perhaps become too tokenistic and maybe masks the much more serious effect of climate change. I wonder what you'd say to people on the other side of the aisle who believe that their individual actions matter in maybe having meat Mondays, or maybe changing their diet, or changing the car emissions they're using, and would rather still enjoy the normal life they live with some changes that they feel are significant.
Well, it's sort of 101 political sociology, right? That when a crisis hits a society and a state, then the state takes control of that society and takes control of the economy in order to respond to the crisis. If there's any sort of deterministic rule of thumb, then that's the case. So regardless of ideology, and we've had an example, of course, of that with COVID, which is all the regimes around the world, with the possible exception of the States and Brazil, have engaged in state intervention in society in order to enact major changes in behavior in order to minimize mass death. So at this stage in history, there's only one viable scenario which will respond adequately to the extremity that we face, which is the state intervention in society in order to persuade, and if not persuade, enforce and coerce a massive change in individual behaviour and economic activity. And that's really the only game in town at this stage in history. So again, let me emphasise, this isn't a moralistic point, you know, I'm a vegan and I don't fly and all the rest of it, but that's not the issue at this moment. It might have been the issue in 1995. And this is the major challenge, is to understand that in 2021, there is a phased transition, as it were, in the status of what the climate catastrophe represents. It represents something fundamentally different to what it represented 20 years ago. At this point in history, we are looking at social collapse due to temperatures going over 2 degrees centigrade. And there's nothing we can do about that apart from the possible intervention of mass geoengineering.
Thank you. So in the situation we are now, it's almost like we must act immediately. And of course, to achieve that level of public's acceptance or having the public on your side will be very, very helpful. And one question that I thought was relevant was by President James Bryce, and he asked whether you ever stopped to wonder whether turning the majority against you with such displays of direct action will fail, and would you be helping environmental degradation by working outside the system?
Well, you're quite right that the methodology of mass civil disobedience, as practiced by Martin Luther King and Gandhi and other similar figures, involves the alienation of a large proportion of the population in the early stages of the confrontation. So, for instance, in 1961, Martin Luther King was arguably the most unpopular man in America, and by 1967, he was arguably the most popular man in America. Now, it's important to understand the dynamics of how civil disobedience works, in so much as it does work and in so much as you've got a favourable context for it. So it's no point engaging in civil disobedience, for instance, on an issue where the majority of the population have an absolute opposition to what you want to propose. So, you know, to take a slightly silly example, if I wanted everyone to wear red hats, it doesn't matter how many motorways I close, people still aren't going to wear red hats because they fundamentally disagree with it. Where civil disobedience works is where there's a fundamental contradiction in the values of society between what a society says it believes in and what it's actually doing. So, to use the analogy with the civil rights movement, you know, broadly speaking, the American public was of the opinion that all people were of equal worth under the American Constitution, and that was massively violated by the structural racism of Black people in the South. So what Martin Luther King did, of course, was, and the civil rights movement, was dramatize that contradiction through mass civil disobedience. Now, how the dynamic goes is initially, as we are all aware, when you're challenged on a moral contradiction, you become defensive and you don't like being challenged on it. And at a certain point, if you're dealt with respectfully, then you change your mind and realize the errors of your ways, as it were, and then some structural change happens. So with the climate catastrophe, of course, everyone's aware that it's a bad thing and it's coming down the line. And the values of society are such that we believe we should look after our children, we should look after nature, and we should look after our societies and our countries. So the great contradiction in our present context is that we want all those things. That's what we consciously think we want, but we're engaging collectively in the diametric opposite of that through allowing our governments to put CO2 into the environment. So this is a classic case where mass civil disobedience works because it basically dramatizes that contradiction. But it's important to understand that in the early stages of that process, then everyone hates you, to be blunt, because no one likes to change. We all know that in our personal lives, right? It's just basic human psychology. If someone challenges you, then you react negatively. But because it remains non-violent, it remains respectful towards the opposition, it provides a face-saving mechanism, as you might say, through which a society changes. And you saw a small example of that with the Extinction Rebellion mass civil disobedience events, when before April 2019, before 1,200 people arrested, then most of the British public either didn't care or didn't know about the climate emergency. And afterwards, I think the statistic is something like 65% agreed there was a climate emergency. So that's a small iteration, of course, of civil disobedience. In order to create, substantive change, then you probably need enough people to engage in civil disobedience to have 10,000 arrests, and then you'll find major structural legislative change is brought through.
Thank you. Just very quickly, how close do you think we are to that sort of like turning point where, with thousands being more arrested, we get the people on side? Because at the moment, although people do agree that there needs to be a climate change revolution, there is some level of, at least according to what you described, reluctance or lackadaisical efforts from the politicians and from the voters.
Well, the core causal element, as it were, in the creation of civil resistance and mass civil disobedience is not really the structural characteristics of the society, strangely enough, because often people think it is. The real causal variable, as it were, is the organisation and organisational ability and strategic coherence of the activist core, in order as the revolutionaries or radicals to engage in the mobilisation. So the key challenge over the next year as we come out of COVID is to create mass mobilisation systems in the countries around the world, which is what I'm engaged in. And that's my invitation, I suppose, is the most rational and moral thing for Oxford students to do, is to leave their courses in so much as they're going into dead end scenarios, as I've shown, and to join in those mass mobilizations around the world. And those mass mobilizations will, through organizational coherence, as it were, create the 10 or 20,000 people in the countries who will engage in civil disobedience and get arrested. And it's important to understand that every state has quite surprisingly high vulnerability to organized civil disobedience. So, for instance, like leading judges in the UK have informed Extinction Rebellion that if there was more than 3,000 arrests within 2 weeks, then the police and security forces and judiciary system would be overwhelmed, and you would be looking at some sort of structural response, legislative response from the government. And you can see examples of that, for instance, in the Black Lives Matter protests in the States, where state legislatures started to entertain the idea of structural reform of the police. And also in the French uprising of 2018, when the police went to the French state after 10 weeks of protests and told them to sort the situation out, otherwise they wouldn't perform their duties on the front lines after the Christmas period. So there's plenty of empirical evidence this works, but it's difficult to conceive of it, of course, before it's actually happened. But it does happen over and over again, and you just need to look at the record to understand that.
Thank you. On the point of strategic coherence being needed in order to sort of like achieve the structural changes that the climate change cause advocates, one can understand that for many people, especially those who are climate change deniers, feeling as if there's a message of doom and gloom, or there's an inconsistency in what the facts are, allows to reinforce feelings that maybe that these are just exaggerated calls and there is no issues. And one thing that kind of points on this problem, which Peter Watson has pointed out, is that how yourself in XR's predictions of how likely climate change will impact are much more worse than the expert consensus in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. And he wonders why your why you're giving predictions that differ from these academic experts. I understand I'm asking that question at the risk of I'm falling into the Cambridge University trap there. But much more importantly, I think that in order to achieve this strategic coherence that you're trying to attain, we need to all be singing from the same hymn sheet and have the same voice. And if one can poke holes in the arguments by saying that we don't know what we're talking about, all people who are climate change advocates have different figures and different interpretations and predictions, it doesn't bode well for convincing either the denier or the lay public member.
Yes, well, you can take this on two levels. So taking it at face value, the reason why the figures I produced are more radical in inverted commas than the consensus is because the consensus is politically influenced. So as a good sociologist, you should never take the figures stats at face value. You always have to look at the social space in which those statistics are produced. So for instance, a classic example of this is if you ask people whether they're going to vote for the Tory party, a lot of people will say they're not going to vote for the Tories and then do because of what's called the shy Tory syndrome. In other words, like people don't want to admit they're voting for the Tories. Now, any decent sociologist will therefore, and polling companies do this now, they'll take that into account. So let's say 30% say, they'll vote Tory, but you should really assume it's 33% for the sake of argument, right? So if you're looking at the IPC process, then you should use the same sociological political intelligence, which is to say it has to go through Russia and Saudi Arabia and various political influences before it comes out. So you don't really need to be a genius to work out that it's going to be more conservative than what you might call an objective prediction. And there's a whole bunch of what you might call resonance sort of syndromes within the conventional science space. So that's the reason why the figures I'm producing are arguably more radical than the IPC. But a more profound point here is even if you take the IPCC figures, it's pretty irrelevant, quibbling around them in 2021 because they're all catastrophic. In other words, like the revolutionary imperative applies whether you take the IPC figures or my figures, or because they're all beyond terrible. In other words, as the people in the UN and leading public figures have said, we're facing social collapse unless there's a massive reduction in carbon emissions and massive geoengineering. And the sociological point I'm saying, which is my specialism, is that political regimes simply cannot change that fast. They're not able to engage in the structural changes when they've been unable to do so, of course, over the last 30 years. And in addition to that, you've got the impact of the moral horror of populations who realize that these politicians and elites have engaged knowingly in creating this catastrophe. So they're going to be removed anyway due to the moral outrage of populations around the world when they realize what's been done to them by these elites.
Thank you. We've got about 7 minutes to the close, so I've got a chance for maybe one or two more questions. One question that I got from the anonymous attendee is basically about what you think that social revolution is going to look like after it's implemented. What concretely would need to change in everyday people's lives?
Well, the key answer to this is whatever's necessary, right? Because the consequence of doing what's not necessary is beyond the imagination bad. So I'm not an expert. I'm an expert in how to produce political change, which doesn't mean I'm always right, but I'm an expert in it. I'm not an expert in the specific ins and outs of how to de-electrify the economy and produce wind turbines and all the rest of it. Having said that, in my non-expert opinion, I think if we are looking at three things over the next 5 to 10 years. So I think the first thing and the most controversial thing, which is in denial, is that consumption levels will probably have to be reduced by 50%. In order, the quickest way to reduce carbon emissions is to reduce consumption. And 1% of the world's population produces double the carbon of the bottom half of the population. So in terms of social revolution, the most necessary thing is for the rich to lose their privileges, as it were, and for there to become a more a radically new egalitarian regime. Now, again, that happens to coincide with the socialist left-wing agenda. However, I would argue that it's structurally determined, in so much as when states come under pressure, then they will always introduce egalitarian methods, not least because they need to raid, as you might say, the resources of the rich in order to survive. So again, I'm not making a big radical political point there. So the first thing is the rapid reduction in consumption levels. The second thing is the massive investment, obviously, in decarbonising the economy, which everyone knows about. And the third thing is massive investment in geoengineering. So I talked, for instance, to a Harvard guy the other day who said, we need to spend $100 trillion, I think it is, to cover the Sahara with mirrors, which sounds like a science fiction sort of scenario, but apparently that's what's necessary. But he did give the caveat that this has to be done in the next 5 to 10 years. Otherwise, quote, it will be too late. So every month and year that this goes by, then the extremity of the necessary changes in consumption and economic transformation and investment in geoengineering become exponentially more dramatic. And really, this is the nub of the point of my presentation, I suppose, is you might hate what I say and you don't want to see all these things happen. But the intelligent people in the audience will realize that every time you deny what I'm suggesting, then you risk what happens being even worse than what I'm suggesting. Do you see what I'm trying to say? If you ignore this, it just gets exponentially worse. So again, this isn't a radical argument, right? It's an argument about dynamics. So you saw this, for instance, with capitalism in the early part of the 20th century, where in order to save capitalism, you had to transform it into socialism in order for it not to collapse and eat itself up. So that was like a technocratic argument, right, which was promoted by Keynes and Roosevelt in the 30s. So it's a similar situation now. If you want to maintain some resemblance of a capitalist free market economy, for the sake of argument, then the faster you have your revolution and transform society, then the more likely you'll retain remnants of it. Because in 5 or 10 years' time, all the concrete options will involve some horrendous form of authoritarianism at best. So that's the name of the game.
Thank you. So I think we only got maybe one more chance for one last question. I think that perhaps the most fitting one is one that kind of ties into your opening last quote and also your last quote now, where you mentioned, if you hate what I talking about, whether it's important that people hear what you say, if it is the case that what you're talking about is got such drastic and very pertinent emergent crisis related effects. And the question effectively is, in the past, you've once sort of like referred to the Holocaust as almost a normal event, just another effery in human history, and something that you've recognized as anti-Semitic and have since apologized for. I thought, what advice would you give to sort of well-intentioned activists who in their efforts to try to drive the point across might end up sort of either alienating communities or making those who would naturally want to be the supporters drawn back? Would you stand by the fact that what matters is that message, not the delivery, or would you recommend a different approach?
Well, as I've said on many occasions, I've apologized for those comments and the interpretation or taking them out of context by the German newspaper. But I'd like to make two broader points about this, is that if you tell the truth at a time of rapid political change, then unsurprisingly, people will try and manipulate your character and your message to denigrate you and cancel you and remove you from the public sphere. And I'm very grateful that you've invited me here today to speak, because it'd be quite easy to ignore that truth, as it were. So you should, if you're going to speak the truth in society at a time of horrendous horror, right, which is what I'm describing here, then it shouldn't come as a surprise that you're entering a very dangerous territory, both to yourself and your reputation and all the rest of it. And that's really part of the process of bringing about political change. But in terms of the ethics of the situation, that's why I started with the quote from John Locke, not because it's from John Locke. John Locke's got his pros and cons, as we all know, but because what quote connects really with the heart of the moral tradition in many cultures and societies, which is, if a society perpetuates a fundamental untruth, a fundamental lie, then it will destroy itself. That's probably the deepest collective wisdom of the human experience. So in the present context, we're in the process of telling ourselves the most horrendous lie, which is we can continue with the form of economic activity we have and not destroy the lives of our children. And that's a lie. And if we continue to live that lie, then we will have the reputation of being the most stupid and immoral generation in the history of humanity.
Thank you very much, Roger Hallam. It's been a pleasure speaking to you today. I'm sure that the members would gain a lot from your wisdom and your advocacy for climate change and climate justice. I'd like to thank everyone else who's watching the webinar today. I also like to remind them about the wonderful events we have this evening, which is Raw Spirit OBE at 6 p.m. And of course, the later events we have for the rest of the week, which you can't see on our website, term card. Thank you very much, Roger, again. And I hope that everyone has a good evening. It's been a pleasure having you.
Yeah, thanks very much.